On November 29, 1981, the body of Natalie Wood was pulled from the waters off Catalina Island. At just 43 years old, she had lived a lifetime in front of the camera, but her final hours would eclipse all her screen performances. To understand the weight of her disappearance that night, we must first trace the path of the woman Hollywood never stopped watching. Natalie Wood was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in San Francisco in 1938, the daughter of Russian immigrants who believed fiercely in their daughter's potential. Her mother, Maria, was determined to see Natalie succeed in Hollywood. By age 4, Natalie was acting in small roles, her wide eyes and porcelain face catching the attention of producers. By her teenage years, she was already a star, winning acclaim for her performance in Rebel Without a Cause alongside James Dean. That role cemented her as not only a child prodigy but a serious actress with the ability to portray vulnerability and intensity in equal measure. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Natalie Wood became one of the most recognizable faces in cinema. Films like West Side Story and Splendour in the Grass made her a cultural icon. She seemed untouchable, beautiful, talented, and consistently in demand. Yet fame, as always, came at a cost. In interviews, she often spoke about the isolation of growing up under the spotlight, the pressure to perform, and her mother's unyielding push for perfection. She longed for stability, something outside of the industry that had consumed her since childhood. That stability seemed to arrive when she fell for Robert Wagner, a rising actor with matinee idol looks. They married in 1957, when Natalie was just 19. To the public, it seemed like a union pulled straight from the silver screen. Two glamorous stars, both adored by audiences, united in marriage. But the reality was less perfect. Their first marriage was plagued by conflict and ended in divorce in 1962. Both moved on, Wagner remarried, and Natalie had relationships of her own. But fate brought them back together. In 1972, they remarried, and for years afterward, Natalie spoke about Wagner as the love of her life. Still, whispers never stopped. Wagner's jealousy, particularly of Natalie's career and male co-stars, became an open secret in Hollywood circles. Friends noted that arguments between the two were not unusual. But Natalie's devotion to Wagner seemed unshaken. She clung to the idea of building a family and a stable home life. They had a daughter together, and Natalie also raised her daughter from her previous marriage. Outwardly, the Wagners had everything: wealth, fame, and a picture-perfect family. As the 1980s approached, Natalie's career slowed. She shifted her focus to her family, though she remained deeply respected in Hollywood. That fall, she was cast in Brainstorm, a science fiction film co-starring Christopher Walken, an actor nearly 2 decades her junior. Walken, known for his eccentric intensity, developed a friendship with Natalie during filming. Industry gossip hinted at Wagner's discomfort with their closeness, though Natalie insisted their bond was professional. Against this backdrop, the Thanksgiving weekend trip to Catalina Island was arranged. Aboard Wagner's yacht, Splendour, would be 4 people: Natalie, Wagner, Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. Catalina, just off the coast of Southern California, was a favored retreat for the Wagners, a place where they could escape Hollywood's constant scrutiny. The weekend promised relaxation, drinks, and conversation under the cool autumn sky. But Splendour was no ordinary yacht. At over 60 feet long, it was a floating symbol of Hollywood wealth, outfitted for luxury but small enough to become a pressure cooker for the emotions of its passengers. Those who knew Natalie were well aware of her discomfort with deep water. She had spoken often about her fear of drowning, a phobia rooted in a chilling prediction her mother once received from a fortune teller when Natalie was a child. The psychic told Maria that her daughter would die in dark water. Natalie herself, in interviews, admitted she could not swim and avoided being near open water whenever possible. Despite that fear, she agreed to spend Thanksgiving weekend at sea. On November 27, 1981, the yacht anchored near 2 harbors, Catalina. The group spent the day drinking heavily, enjoying meals and socializing. At first glance, it was a gathering of friends and colleagues. Yet beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Wagner, decades into his career, was no longer the heartthrob he once was, while Walken was in demand and on the rise. Wagner reportedly disliked Walken's closeness with Natalie and suspected more than simple camaraderie. For a man already known for possessiveness, the setting created fertile ground for conflict. Natalie, on the other hand, was conflicted about her future. Friends recalled she was considering stepping back into acting full-time, and Walken encouraged her not to abandon her career for domestic life. Wagner, however, preferred Natalie at home, anchoring their family rather than competing for roles. This subtle clash of values, Natalie's desire for independence and Wagner's need for control, hovered over the group that weekend. As evening approached on November 28th, the atmosphere on Splendour shifted. Catalina's skies darkened, and the seas grew restless with a cold November wind. Alcohol flowed steadily, amplifying emotions that might otherwise have remained unspoken. For Natalie, the night was one of unease. Surrounded by water she feared, caught between a husband prone to jealousy and a co-star who seemed to embody the independence she once cherished, she found herself in a setting as volatile as the seas surrounding them. It was against this backdrop that the chain of events leading to her disappearance would soon unfold. The world would later hear fragments of raised voices, stories of anger, and accounts of tension, but all that lay just ahead. On that Saturday evening, Natalie Wood was still alive, still fighting to balance her career, her marriage, and her identity. By the next morning, she would be gone, leaving only unanswered questions and a legacy overshadowed by tragedy. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Natalie Wood. The evening of November 28, 1981, was deceptively ordinary when it began. Aboard Splendour, anchored off Catalina Island, the group prepared for dinner at Doug's Harbor Reef, a small but popular restaurant near Two Harbors. Natalie wore a fashionable dark jacket, her hair perfectly styled as always. Wagner, Walken, and Davern accompanied her ashore, and the four settled into a corner table. First, the mood was festive. Witnesses later described the party as lively, with rounds of champagne and cocktails flowing freely. But as the evening progressed, tension surfaced. Walken and Natalie engaged in an animated conversation about her career, with Walken urging her not to give up acting in favor of a quieter domestic life. Wagner, already unsettled by their closeness, grew increasingly irritated. The restaurant's staff noticed Wagner's shifting demeanor, his smile tightening as he drank steadily. By the time the group left for the yacht around 10 p.m., the dynamic had shifted from friendly to strained. Back aboard Splendour, the night unraveled quickly. Catalina's waters were restless, and the yacht rocked under gusting winds. Inside the cabin, the alcohol continued to pour. Davern later recalled that the tension between Wagner and Walken erupted into a heated argument. Wagner accused Walken of trying to interfere in his marriage, raising his voice in sharp, angry tones. Walken pushed back, telling Wagner that Natalie had a right to her independence and that her career was hers to decide. Natalie, caught in the middle, withdrew. She hated confrontations, especially when drinking had heightened emotions beyond reason. According to Davern, she eventually left the main cabin and retreated to her stateroom, visibly upset. The argument between Wagner and Walken escalated. Davern, uncertain whether to intervene, stayed nearby, listening as their voices clashed. Wagner accused Walken of trying to seduce Natalie, while Walken dismissed the accusation as absurd. The shouting grew so loud it seemed to shake the yacht as much as the waves. At some point, the argument ended abruptly. Walken excused himself and retreated to his cabin, slamming the door. Wagner followed Natalie into their stateroom, where another argument reportedly broke out. The details of what happened inside remain murky. Davern claimed he heard things being thrown, raised voices, and a door slamming. Minutes later, Wagner re-emerged, visibly flushed and unsettled. He opened another bottle of wine and sat in silence. By midnight, the yacht was eerily quiet. The storm outside had grown stronger, with rain streaking the decks and the wind howling through the rigging. Around this time, Wagner noticed Natalie was gone. He claimed he assumed she had gone to bed in another cabin or possibly gone up on deck. But when he checked, she was nowhere to be found. What happened in that crucial window remains the core mystery. The yacht's dinghy, a small inflatable boat named Valiant, was also missing. Wagner suggested Natalie had untied it herself to head ashore, though this explanation puzzled many who knew her fear of dark water and her avoidance of small boats. Natalie rarely set foot in the dinghy without someone else piloting it. At 1:30 a.m., Wagner placed a call to shore, reporting that Natalie was missing. Authorities were not immediately mobilized. Instead, Wagner and Davern searched the yacht and the shoreline with flashlights. Hours slipped by before an official search began. It wasn't until 3:30 a.m. that the Coast Guard was notified, and only after dawn did the full-scale operation begin. Just before 8 a.m. on November 29th, searchers found the Valiant adrift less than a mile from Splendour. The boat was scratched along its sides but otherwise functional. Shortly after, Natalie's body was discovered floating face down about 200 yards from the dinghy, clad in a red down jacket, flannel nightgown, and wool socks. She had no life jacket, no shoes, and no signs of having prepared for a trip ashore. The discovery sent shockwaves across the island. Word traveled quickly from the Coast Guard to Hollywood, and within hours, the news broke worldwide. Natalie Wood, the luminous star of stage and screen, was dead in the waters she had feared her entire life. When her body was brought ashore, the scene was chaotic. Photographers gathered, reporters swarmed, and authorities scrambled to establish facts. The initial examination revealed bruises on her arms and legs, along with superficial abrasions. The official cause of death was declared accidental drowning and hypothermia. Authorities suggested she had tried to secure the dinghy, slipped, and fallen into the water. But even in those early hours, the explanation raised questions. Why would Natalie, terrified of dark water, venture alone into a stormy night? Why was there a delay in reporting her missing? And why did bruises appear in places inconsistent with a simple fall? Back aboard Splendour, the surviving passengers, Wagner, Walken, and Davern, were left under a cloud of suspicion. Walken remained silent, issuing only a brief statement that Natalie's death was a terrible accident. Wagner, visibly distraught, stayed by his lawyer's side and avoided public comment beyond his initial claims. Davern, however, would later break ranks, suggesting that the events aboard the yacht were far more violent and complicated than Wagner admitted. By the end of that Sunday, Natalie's body had been flown back to Los Angeles. Hollywood mourned, but behind the scenes, the whispers began. Theories circulated almost immediately, as friends and colleagues who knew Natalie questioned whether the truth was being told. The official version, an accident, seemed too simple for a night filled with conflict, jealousy, and fear. This was not the ending anyone expected for Natalie Wood. It was abrupt, brutal, and filled with contradictions. The questions sparked that night would persist for decades, growing louder as new testimony emerged and old wounds were reopened. For now, though, all the public knew was that a beloved actress had vanished into the sea, and the circumstances surrounding her final hours were far from clear. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department took immediate control of the case once Natalie's body was recovered, and within hours, the world awaited answers. The yacht Splendour was docked and examined, but what investigators found or failed to find raised more questions than clarity. From the outset, the official explanation leaned heavily toward accident. Sheriff's deputies suggested that Natalie may have attempted to secure the dinghy, slipped on the wet deck, and fallen into the water. The bruises and abrasions on her body were attributed to contact with the yacht's hull or rocks in the bay. Hypothermia, they said, quickly robbed her of strength. Yet, the initial statements from those aboard did not align seamlessly. Wagner claimed he had last seen Natalie around 11:30 p.m., when she retired to their stateroom after a heated argument. He alleged that hours later, upon noticing her absence, he assumed she had gone to adjust the dinghy, despite her well-known fear of dark, open water. Walken's version was far less detailed. He said he went to bed after the argument and heard nothing until Wagner raised the alarm. Davern, the captain, gave a statement consistent with Wagner's at the time, though his later recantations would prove explosive. The autopsy, performed by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, added layers of intrigue rather than resolution. In addition to bruising on Natalie's arms and legs, the examination revealed a fresh abrasion on her cheek and scratches consistent with defensive movements. Noguchi concluded that the death was accidental drowning, but he admitted the possibility of an altercation preceding her entry into the water. The presence of alcohol in her system, nearly twice the legal driving limit, was emphasized, suggesting impairment. Still, for those who knew her intimately, the conclusion seemed unsatisfactory. Hollywood reeled. The news media broadcast conflicting reports. Some underscored the tragic accident narrative, while others hinted at darker possibilities. Rumors swirled about Wagner's jealousy, Walken's involvement, and Natalie's state of mind. Behind closed doors, law enforcement faced intense pressure to close the case quickly, wary of inflaming a scandal around such high-profile figures. By December 1st, just days after her death, the investigation was officially ruled an accident. But time did not silence suspicion. Forensic experts, journalists, and even members of Natalie's own family expressed unease. The bruising patterns were difficult to reconcile with a mere slip. The dinghy's condition puzzled investigators. It was found with its ignition off, the oars stowed, and no evidence it had been prepared for use. Most damningly, there were gaps in the timeline. If Natalie had disappeared around midnight, why was the Coast Guard not called until after 3 a.m.? Those lost hours haunted every re-examination of the case. In 1983, a journalist revisited the incident, publishing an article that questioned the official conclusion. The piece reignited public debate, casting doubt on Wagner's account. Davern, then still loyal to his employer, publicly defended Wagner, though his body language and guarded answers hinted at unease. For the next 2 decades, the case drifted between public memory and rumor, but it never truly faded. Everything changed in 2011. On the 30th anniversary of Natalie's death, Dennis Davern broke his silence. In interviews and later in a book, he claimed that Wagner's account was a lie. According to Davern, the argument between Wagner and Walken had been fierce, but what followed between Wagner and Natalie was far worse. He alleged that Wagner, enraged, followed Natalie to their stateroom, where shouts and crashes erupted. Later, Davern said, he saw Wagner return alone, distressed and drinking heavily. Hours passed before Wagner allowed him to notify authorities. Davern insisted that Natalie's death was not an accident, but the result of a confrontation gone wrong. The revelation forced law enforcement to reopen the case. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office amended the death certificate, changing the manner of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. This small but significant shift acknowledged what many had long suspected, that the circumstances could not be neatly explained by accident alone. The reopening of the case drew new forensic analysis. Experts argued that the bruises on Natalie's body were consistent with being forcibly restrained or pushed. The placement of the marks on her wrists and forearms suggested defensive wounds. Even the abrasion on her cheek was reconsidered as possible evidence of a physical altercation. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses and reviewed the yacht's timeline. Walken, largely silent for decades, participated reluctantly, offering no new information. Wagner, however, remained at the center of scrutiny. By 2018, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department publicly named Wagner a person of interest. Though not charged, the implication was clear. Investigators no longer accepted the accidental narrative at face value. The revelation fractured public perception. To some, Wagner was a grieving husband unfairly maligned by rumor. To others, he was a man shielded by fame and influence, long insulated from consequences. The mystery deepened as Wagner himself refused to answer detailed questions, dismissing Davern's claims as fabrications. His reluctance only fueled speculation. As the investigation stretched into its 4th decade, the evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial. No eyewitness had seen what happened in Natalie's final moments. No forensic test could definitively prove whether she fell, jumped, or was pushed. And yet, the weight of contradiction, the bruises, the missing hours, the silence, painted a picture too troubling to ignore. Natalie Wood's death had shifted from a tragic accident to one of Hollywood's most enduring cold cases. The investigation, rather than closing doors, had flung them wide open, exposing fractures in the official story and leaving behind an unsettling void. By the late 2010s, the case was no longer just about what happened on Splendour. It was about whether the truth could ever be uncovered at all. As the decades passed, Natalie Wood's death became more than a police file. It transformed into a cultural fault line where celebrity, tragedy, and justice intersected. For Hollywood, her loss was personal. She had been part of its fabric since childhood. For the public, her mysterious end shifted her from movie star to enduring enigma, the circumstances of her death forever inseparable from her legacy. The years following the reopening of the case exposed just how deeply the uncertainty had permeated collective memory. Documentaries, television specials, and investigative reports dissected every fragment of evidence. The crime scene was revisited in painstaking detail, autopsy reports scrutinized by new experts, and the testimony of witnesses combed for contradictions. Each program reignited interest, drawing in new generations of viewers who hadn't even been alive when Natalie drowned. The case became a staple of true crime discussions, proving that unresolved stories do not fade, they evolve. What made Natalie's disappearance into the water so haunting was not simply the possibility of foul play. It was the broader question of accountability. How could a woman vanish from a yacht surrounded by friends and family, only for her death to remain unsolved for decades? That paradox resonated beyond Hollywood, symbolizing the troubling notion that truth can be elusive even when witnesses are close at hand.